So today's webinar is going to focus on exploring critical methodologies within qualitative research practices by specifically looking at some principles of critical theory that are key for qualitative research. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about Dr. Christian Chan, who's going to be sharing a lot of good work here, and then I'll hand this right off to him. Dr. Christian Chan is an assistant professor of counseling at Idaho State University and president-elect of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, or AADA. His interests revolve around intersectionality, multiculturalism in counseling, supervision and counselor education, social justice and activism, career development, critical research and methodologies, intergenerational conflict in families, and couple, family, and group modalities within socialization and communication of culture and social identities. Wow, that's a mouthful. His prior professional experiences include case management with foster care adolescents, career development, higher ed administration, and individual couples, parent-child, group, and family counseling services. As a recent recipient of the AADA's President's Outstanding Service Award and Algebra-Tics Ned Farley Service Award, he actively contributes to peer-reviewed publications in journals, books, and edited volumes, and has conducted over 115 refereed presentations at the national and regional and state levels. So we are very excited to have Dr. Chan here today. I'm confident in this next front end piece here, we'll all get to know each other better. But without further ado, let me just hand this over to you, Dr. Chan. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Gideon and Gretchen, for this really wonderful opportunity. I am certainly excited and at the same time feel very connected to the work that is happening in the CRLL and certainly to the topic at hand today. And so I feel very thankful for not only this opportunity, but the collaboration that has happened with CRLL to design and develop this series. It is something that is very close to my heart and in many ways was inspired by the work of mentors who really shared this work in community with me. And so, and I think it's so funny, I'm gonna give a shout out to my, I can remember a few years ago now, my dissertation committee, which included the fabulous Dr. Sam Steen, Dr. Lionel Howard, who is my methodologist, and also Dr. Arshad Ali, who is also a qualitative researcher, but also somebody who really was the facilitator of developing my knowledge and my understanding and my grasp of critical research methodologies. And so much of that work has inspired what I do now and what I continue to hope to do across the rest of my career. I think in many ways where this all stemmed from for me was seeing the disparity and the disconnect between what we do in terms of our scholarship and research and what we're even teaching, not only in terms of counseling practice, but how we are thoughtfully teaching research methods. Because it's not just about the methods itself, it's about the ways that we show up in these methods and the ways that our participants ultimately will show up. And in so many cases, we're seeing it now, right? I'm excited that we continue to see different scholars identify some of these paradigms, particularly within the work that we do in the counseling profession. And then in the same manner, what I often see, right? And it's almost this cringeworthy moment of when, and we'll be walking through this, that it's this cringeworthy moment of sometimes me hearing people almost utilize some of these different paradigms, these different words, these different terms, without knowing the weight of really what that means. And so I think in so many cases, I've seen this happen in presentations where somebody is going off and spewing out stuff about, I'm decolonizing, and I'm like, hold up a minute, like that's not a metaphor nor a synonym for what you're trying to do. And it's not to discredit the work that they are doing, but to say, hold up a minute, I don't know if you understand the ramifications of what is happening. And in many cases here, it's also about that what Eve Tuck and Wayne Young definitely speak to in their 2012 article, really focusing on decolonization not as a metaphor. And so in many cases today, my hope is this will be one way to continue sparking our journeys together in ways that can manifest in more exploration and more work around critical research methodologies in the work that you're doing, because I see this in so many ways as my hope for our profession, that we can continue to mainstream critical methodologies into the work that we do, both in a qualitative and a quantitative fashion. So that's where my heart in this work really comes from. And the other piece too, I want to identify here is, so this is part one. This is really a large overview. And I also recognize, like, especially even today, as I was reviewing and preparing and looking over some of my slides, you know, there are different paradigms that I will allude to, but I didn't have a chance to go into depth with. So I know we'll be talking about intersectionality, but I probably won't be able to cover Black feminism, but I'll definitely include some pieces, particularly with like how Black feminism is also distinct, but also intertwined with intersectionality. So it's definitely rooted in intersectionality, but I also want to give credit to some of the scholars who have been also sustaining that work, particularly in research methodology and educational research. So the other piece here is that, for example, there are other newer paradigms that have been showing up, like queer of color critique, two-spirit critique. When we think about, I'm thinking about queer theory, so not just queer theory, but queer theory, so Q-U-A-R-E, and how that's also solidified around certain communities, right, that are within these intersections. So not just looking at, okay, just one single issue or one single social identity, but really helping us to think, okay, what are these intersections even looking like? So with that being said, you know, I want to start here. I want to start here because, one, I know that, you know, the opportunity to do webinars, it can always feel like I'm talking and I'm just talking the whole time. And I think in some way, where I want to start is really to ask each of you as collaborators here in this webinar, really to reflect on these 4 questions. So I set up a categorization here of different social identities. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but many of these social identities are some of the first ones that come to us very quickly. And so I want you to reflect on these. Take probably the next, let's just say 10 minutes to write down some responses and reflections to yourself. So I know some people are on computers, some people have notepads next to them. So feel free to write some notes to yourself. I want us to really think about these different reflection questions with some time and depth. All right, so here's a nice segue, right? So the challenge I'm going to pose to everybody is that because we are a small collaborative group today, I would like for everybody, as part of your introduction, to share in your introduction who you are, where you're joining us from, so and perhaps what role you have, whether you're a practitioner, a supervisor, counselor, educator, student, anything to that effect. And if you could share with the group a response to one of the questions. So just one response. And anybody can feel free to start anywhere.
I'll go.
Awesome.
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Hi, I'm Kalisha. I'm coming from Ohio. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Cincinnati. What roles do I have? I feel like I got many roles at this point. I'm a clinician, both a group facilitator and does individual counseling, but I'm also finishing up my dissertation. And so I'm doing qualitative research, particularly within self-awareness, within multiculturalism. And so this is really close to my heart at this point. And as far as for how this, I'll take the last question. How does your own social identities and position affect how you see your participants? For me, I try to shift the power paradigm within my research, which has been pretty interesting. And it's definitely a process. It's not one that's always the most well accepted, I'm finding out, but it is something that I find to be very important, especially going further within, multicultural research.
Thank you, Kalisha.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annabelle. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of New Orleans, so I'm joining you from New Orleans. I'm as well in the dissertation phase of my studies, and practically I'm interested a lot in intergenerational historical trauma, and that's the topic of my dissertation. I'm using constructivist grounded theory for my dissertation. However, I thought that as I will go forward, and I would like to kind of keep on pursuing this topic, critical methodologies would be useful in investigating further this topic. So that's what really got me interested, and I feel that I'm pretty much of a novice in these type of methodologies. I don't feel I know much. So hopefully this will be a useful introduction to get familiar. And once you're using these methodologies, I like what Dr. Chen pointed out, and we use them. This is not like I'm using them metaphorically, but we use them and we honor their value and as useful tools to give voice to the participants and to whom your research is representing. I'm also, I think, taking my last question as, I operate from a feminist philosophy. So when I do research, I try as much as possible to share my power with the research participants. So I try to adopt quite a non-conventional way of a researcher. I have some questions. I share the questions with the participants before I have them come up with their own questions to answer kind of areas that kind of are not covered by my interview protocol. So I try as much as possible to give them a say, even when analyzing the data. So this is kind of how I try to approach research. I'm an international student, and I'm originally from Malta. So this is a topic as well of historical trauma. It is well kind of interesting because I've come from a country which has been colonized over centuries practically. So I think my regional identity and my socioeconomic identity, I think, play quite a significant role in doing research.
Thank you, Annabelle. I'm going to go ahead and read some of the responses in the chat. So here we have Dr. Rochelle Cade, who is a counselor educator in Texas. I'm also going to read this. The question that speaks to me is the third question. My identities and positionality can potentially put me in a voyeuristic position. I describe this in class as like a zoo animal effect. We can observe our participants like people at the zoo, look at the exhibits and animals. Like, oh, look at the monkeys, we say as we get to observe and walk away. We consume their experience and then get to walk away to the next exhibit. And then we go to the next exhibit and say, look at the zebras. And we can keep doing this. These examples help to demonstrate the potential voyeurism, power imbalance, and protected position of the researcher. It can also illuminate a metaphorical cage of the participants. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's pretty in-depth. I'm appreciating everybody's participation on some complex questions.
I'm Jenny, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Northern Colorado, and I am in my dissertation proposal phase. I'm actually doing a quantitative dissertation. I'm working on the development and validation of a humility and counseling scale, and have been working over the last couple of years with Dr. Chris Sink. It was kind of his idea that he threw out there at a conference, and we've been collaborating since then. But I have done just a little bit of qualitative, but I certainly see that as a very, as actually a little bit closer to my heart as who I am as a person. Being later in life, I was a music therapist for many years and then got my master's in counseling, and I worked in the schools for 10 years, primarily middle school. And then I have a private practice, which is what I do now when I'm not doing school. And my desire, I'm going to answer number 2. So I think that my age, being a little later in life and yet new to research, my age and years of experiencing things that aren't changing, aren't going well, or are going downhill, make me want to fix things quickly. And I often get sort of like impatient. The amount of time that it takes to conduct research, publish research, and get it out there is almost painful sometimes to me. And when I look at my life and think I have X number of years, I want things to change, particularly for adolescents in the school system, faster than I think it'll happen. So I recognize that sometimes is driving, and have been interested in things like rapid cycle research, or ways to sort of like single subject to get some things out there faster, and certainly provocation and critical theory. So that I really came to this just wanting to learn and hear and see how I can work with that, because then I juxtapose that impatience with the way I really am and show up in research. Is everything I do is in depth. It's never short. I never give a short answer. I use too many words when I write. I spend long hours talking to people. So I have sort of this like dichotomy going on. So.
Absolutely. So I really appreciate your reflections, Jenny. I really think in many ways you are alerting all of us to some of the concerns, right, that we still have in our profession about counseling research. And in many cases, so much of what we do, even both in qualitative and quantitative traditions, are still affected by the ways that we show up and the ways that our participants will ultimately show up in this research. I think sometimes so I was just earlier speaking today with Gideon and Gretchen about this, but that even there's quant crit, like that actually like critical race theory has manifested in many much more paradigms, epistemological positions. And so in many cases, there's more ways to really critically think about the work that we're doing. And, you can always feel free to reach out to me if you're curious about hearing more about quant crit, and that offer goes for everybody. So I also know we have four more introductions. I am keeping track. So, but because we're a small group, I'd love to hear from everyone. So.
Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome.
Yes.
I'm using my iPad. My laptop broke down yesterday, so
Oh.
I'm second day of the semester and your laptop dies. It's a perfect way to start. So I'm Catherine Lee Estrich. I'm an assistant professor at San Diego State University, and I work specifically within the school counseling program. I have a background in as an elementary school counselor, and I think I'll respond to kind of tapping into all three, but really concentrating on the second. So in thinking about how my social identities and positionality affect the way I conduct research, much of it has to do with the questions that I'm exploring, right? So as a multiracial, primarily biracial woman, there's aspects of my own personal experience that have brought with them questions about experiences of others. And that drew me to phenomenology. I'm also an existentialist in my theoretical standing, so that also aligns with more of a phenomenological approach. And within that approach, I'm very critical with finding ways to explore phenomenon from a descriptive lens. So really approaching it from how are things as they are and as they present themselves, which can be in some ways really challenging when you're working with populations who have been oppressed and historically marginalized, because there's a big movement. There has been movements, especially in constructivist thought, of preserving narratives and how do we examine unique truth while also recognizing some of the universal aspects of those experiences, and so how to balance those two. And within that, being really critical about the relationships being formed within the work. And so being aware of my identity really presents some questions of curiosity from the participants, because most people will, misidentify me. And I think it's really purposeful for me to be very upfront and transparent about my identity from the beginning. And my dissertation was working with Indigenous students.
Yes.
And it was examining cultural identity silencing of Native students in education. And from the forefront, I was transparent about the fact that I am non-Native, and that's really important in establishing those relationships. And I even made some choices within the methodology that parted ways from the descriptive design, but had ways of defending that as it pertained to the population I was working with. And so making sure that I was adhering in some ways to the Indigenous research methodologies and the ethics coming from the methodologies to support the sovereignty of the students, their community, and ultimately their nation, and how to protect that knowledge. And so being very aware of that I'm not giving voice, but how do you work with and for within the work that we're doing, while also examining those phenomenon. So that's the ways in which my social identities have led me in this path, in terms of not only theoretical approach in my practice, but my lens in exploring qualitative phenomenological methodologies, and being really intentional about the ways in which I ask those questions, the ways in which I explore those questions, and the relationships formed during that process, and then taking steps to examine each of those phenomenon as they play out. So research to data, research to participant, research to phenomenon. So
I'm very much appreciating not only the introduction, but also the richness of and the thoughtfulness within the research process. In many ways, we're speaking to what happens when we embody critical work. And part of that for me is also what you were sharing, Dr. Lee Ostruch, that I think what happens here is we sometimes have to part ways with what we see as normative designs, right? And some of the normative strategies that we see, even in qualitative research, that even though there are pieces of qualitative research that offer some flexibility and that we need to adhere to as ways that are productive, helpful, and in some ways we're still trying to legitimize as rigorous. The part of the concern that I certainly see is I can still remember this when I actually had a really, really good challenge from even my own dissertation committee, who had told me, you know what? Why are you saying that because you didn't do groups or focus groups, that it's a limitation? And I was like, I started speaking to it, and they said, if you're doing critical work, you have to remember that you don't need to respond to the positivist or post-positivist angle, and that you can resist that, and it's okay, because in many cases what happens is that we have to at least remember and convey that each of these narratives are powerful and unique and stand on their own right, and they're valuable. All of them are valuable, and in their own unique ways, and not to necessarily distill them and flatten all of their experiences into one categorization, but really to make sure that they are unique in those ways. And sometimes we have to depart from some of the other ways that we think about we thoughtfully integrate our methods and think about the design, because in some ways we're wondering, okay, what's actually what's actually going to be helpful in our interactions with participants. And I love that you elucidated about this experience with having to disclose who you are as a researcher. That's also another piece that I'll share as a takeaway. Sometimes even, for example, I think especially in our field in counseling, we often do a lot of work around phenomenology and semi-structured interview protocols. And I think sometimes what happens is that so many of our participants, like we start jumping into questions, right? But we don't actually verbally walk through some of the ethical constraints. We don't necessarily go through a verbal informed consent, and we make assumptions about, oh, I handed you this informed consent and you read it, so I did my legal, like I did what I was supposed to do by IRB and what was supposed to be done legally. But really, it's really focusing on what is aspirational ethics for us and what that really means in the scope of the projects that we are doing. Because I know it felt so long. I remembered one interview protocol. I mean, even my colleagues, my co-researchers were saying, you know, the interview protocol feels so long. And I was like, well, we have to disclose part of who we are and why we're doing this, because if not, we're not going to be able to build trust with our participants. And that ultimately reflects data adequacy. And because then they might not actually answer any of the questions that we're actually asking them, and they may not even feel safe to answer some of the questions we're asking them. So in many cases, yes, so that's some of the other points I wanted to share. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of the other ones here. So I think Gideon, you were saying, where I resonate with the conversation and the reflection questions is interrogating the role of the quant researcher. I don't have too much experience with qual research, but I'm interested in critical methodologies at large and how these may be applied to quant work too. As a younger, cis, white researcher, I'm attuned to how my limited scope impacts the research work that I consider important. I wrestle with this Johari window in these beginning stages of constructing a research agenda. Yes, definitely. I'm also going to quickly read this by Dr. Pam Jordan. I'm Pam Jordan. I'm a full-time counselor educator in Michigan, as well as a part-time supervisor and clinician. Regarding the third question, I'm a middle-aged, white, cishet woman, and I'm aware I may be seen as part of the problem by members of a number of groups. I continually work to learn and increase my awareness of multicultural and social justice issues at the macro level. And I try to eliminate the divide wherever possible at a micro level. And we also have Dr. Judy Daniels here with us from the University of Hawaii, who's a professor and saying, I love qualitative research and I have been doing it for many years. I think all identities can represent privilege and oppression depending on the social identity. Then living in and doing research in Hawaii impacts the research I do, and I will focus on region as an important factor. I feel that qualitative works well within the cultural context and complexity that frame everything here. I am not Hawaiian, so I have to build on the relationship first in order to get authentic results. Without that relationship base, the research will not truly reflect whatever I am researching. Okay. And, oh, yeah, so good point from Dr. Rochelle Cade. I try to consider how the research can be mutually beneficial. How can the research benefit be consumed or used to benefit the participants, and more specifically by the participants? If it only benefits me, then I am taking from the participants and not giving back. What gives me the space position to just take from people and not give back to them? So these are really, really powerful components here, powerful pieces that you're sharing with me. I think, Justin, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and share?
Yeah, my name is Justin Jock, and I'm a first-year doc student at Oregon State's program. I've been a clinician, this is my 18th year, primarily as my identity, and I work at the Penn State College of Medicine, so I'm coming to you from Hershey, Pennsylvania. I think when I was thinking about the question in terms of social identities, it's something that I think about a lot. The last 3 years I lived in Washington, D.C., and I have a very diverse friend group, and I think we talk about this a lot, and I continually want to know more. And I think I identify as a white cisgender male, so I represent privilege and also probably oppression. And I think in my cohort, I'm one of 14. I'm the only white cis male, and so I feel that that's a very salient part of my identity, and so still trying to work through some of that. My research is on ruptures and repairs in the counseling relationship, looking at using corpus linguistic methodology. And I've done one qualitative study before, and it was a really great experience using grounded theory. It was a 3-year project, but I don't know a ton about critical research methodology, so this is a really exciting presentation.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, so let's keep moving forward, shall we? Right. So I'm going to share a piece of who I am too, right? So I'm asking this of you, but I do want to share this because I see this as rooted in the way that I think about my research, not just the entirety of my research agenda, but really speaking to the different ways that I have to recognize how I embody what it means to be a privileged researcher. And so in both ways, right, and what it really means to embody intersectionality as the life force behind the work that I do. So here I share a piece like that I'm a brown queer person of color. In many cases, I've experienced racism and heterosexism through various different facets of my life. But I also recognize too that I am second generation. I've had a whole lot of acculturation to the United States, so I'm not facing serious amounts of nativism. I'm someone who is a cisgender male, so in many cases, I'm not having to contend with genderism and the ways that my power still really reflects representation, access, understanding of what it means to be in society, and I'm also able-bodied. And so in many cases, what I see here too is my own understanding as we talk about people living with disabilities, that the ableism and stainism that actually happens, particularly within our society, and how it's even commodified. I'm also large and overweight, and for many years of my life have been seen as someone who experienced fat phobia, weightism, and sizeism. So in many cases, I think that's an important part of our conversation as we're locating some of these different forms of oppression. The other piece here is I'm a child of immigrants who experienced significant economic hardship as they acculturated to the United States, but I also grew up in a middle-class family with access to education and opportunities. Spiritually, I'm a pluralistic Catholic who's centered in liberation theology. So what that means for me too is that despite the values and the spiritual experience and meaning making that I have, it also means that I have a lot of privilege seen as something that is the norm, particularly within a history within the United States. So that's the other piece I'll also share here. I'm going to keep moving. So as we discussed in many of the different facets, as we, everybody shared their introductions, as we jumped and launched from that first piece when we were talking to those different reflection questions. And that's why I started here. In many cases, I wanted to start with our positionality, because that in many cases really helps us understand how we embody critical research methods. And I like starting here. I like asking this question because what I can think of is, if anybody's read Michelle Fine's work, but this is such a seminal article, and it starts with "for whom." That was the first part of that title, and it was so powerful and profound. I can remember sitting in a qualitative class, hearing this from my instructor, and I was like, they are absolutely right, because what has happened is we prioritize, right? And this is what happens from that privileged researcher standpoint. We get to prioritize what we see as data, what we value as data, what we value, and who are the participants. Who gets selected ultimately to be participants. We also design and select what pieces of data are ultimately going to be written into our reports, right? So when we write a finding section and the discussion section, we get to prioritize what narratives matter, what data matters. And so in many cases, this is what's also why I start with that question, because for me, and why I think in so many cases we're thinking about positionality and reflexivity here, because when we start there, it is something that we weave pre-design, during the implementation of the design, and after the design, right? Because it's not a process that just stops. For us, it's so important to really understand who we are and how we show up to our participants. And I say that because otherwise, if we're not aware of that, I think very much here, I'm going to link the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, and I'm also going to link the ACA advocacy competencies. But if we don't think at these different levels and how we show up, we have a potential to recast the narratives of our participants in ways that can be so damaging, in ways that only benefit us, just as you all are sharing with us in this community. In many cases, I also, so part of today, you know, there's gonna be regular routine appearances from the Library of Chan. That's why I'm also doing this from my office. So I also want to recommend this, one of Michelle Fine's most recent books. It's called Just Research in Contentious Times, Widening the Methodological Imagination. Michelle Fine's work is somebody I truly adore, and one that I certainly think helps to center us in to critically think and be intentional and purposeful about the work that we're doing. And so something I want to highlight here as we're thinking about reflexivity and researcher subjectivity. So really thinking about how you even introduce methods that really not necessarily make this work objective, but really to understand what is our role in the work, what is our impact in the work. So I think about this. So an example of an insider researcher, and just to clearly define that, an insider researcher, so for example, I can think of my own dissertation, right? That I was doing a research study on privilege and oppression of queer men of color in counselor education doctoral programs. And at the time, of course, I'm part of this community. I'm a queer man of color who's in a counselor education doctoral program. And so what I had to work through was, what are some of the other methods that are going to help me understand my impact on the process and what I prioritize as good data? And so I had two sort of really good pieces here that I tried to inflect. So instead of just saying bracketing, right? Because sometimes with the position of bracketing is like, okay, we're just going to remove our biases up front at the beginning, and just, it's almost like it stops there. But we know, especially in critical research methodologies, that this is an ongoing process, that we have to be not just doing analytic memoing, but really understanding this part of our interactions, our reflections on those interactions, and even the ways that how our positionality keeps showing up in those interactions with our participants. So in many cases, I know, for example, like, especially when I serve on dissertation committees, I often tell students, okay, so I want you to think about what are some strategies that you're going to be working with so you don't prioritize what is good data and what is not good data. Because a lot, I think in so many ways, right? And it's not a bad thing when qualitative researchers do a lot of me-search, right? When they do a lot of research, especially when they're the insider researcher. Sometimes it can be productive, and it can also enrich the connection with participants. And at the same time, the other issue here is sometimes people have not done the personal work on themselves, that they forget that they're actually getting to recast the narratives of their participants. And so what happens here is, I often, like, for example, I told a student, okay, if you're thinking about your coding team, so I want you to really think about how you're educating your coding team to really to really identify any particular discrepant analysis. So because you want them to challenge you on pieces that you find important, because they are going to help you see differently and be in conversation with you about what is important and what is not important in the data. And because otherwise, that's the most challenging part, is that if we don't really do that self-work and that grapple with some of the ways that we see this happen, then we lose sight of how we're really relating our story to the rest, or relating not our story, but relating the story of our participants to the rest of the world. And here's the other piece. I also know researchers who do this, right? They pick the most, sometimes in data, right? They pick the most and select the most intense and shocking passages. And I always have, especially if I'm a consultant or somebody who is serving on a like dissertation committee or working with a colleague, I always have to tell them, okay, I want you to think about what you're like. So if you're selecting that particular excerpt of raw data, what do you think that's going to convey about these communities? Because ultimately, if we don't actually understand how that's going to impact these communities, the hard part here is really that you might convey something that's inaccurate, and it becomes like this whole thing, right? It's almost like we exoticize some of these narratives, and we get to pick like, okay, which is most shocking. And again, that's based on the importance that has been deliberated by the particular researcher or researchers. So again, that's just why I'm saying here, it's like about interrogating our social identity, social location, and our biases, and that it's not just reflection. Reflexivity can be uncomfortable because it taps into our vulnerabilities. And in so many ways here, I'm also speaking again back to this question of for whom. Why Fine and her colleagues had also shared, one thing that I walked away with from that article was that she and her colleagues had shared, part of the issue is that we select the most shocking pieces of data, when sometimes we should be selecting even some of the everyday lived experience or the mundane lived experiences that our participants are sharing with us. All right, let's keep jumping. So, and here's the other piece, as you think about how do I embody critical work, right? So this is stemming a lot from critical theory and what feeds into all these different critical paradigms. So I really love the work of Norman Denson, and of course, like Egan Guba and Ivana Lincoln. These are some good foundational pieces, but to help us center us in what the purpose, the process, and the outcome will ultimately look like in terms of critical theory, right? And how that even feeds into all these critical paradigms. So the hope here is like we're also critiquing some of the different social structures, some of the different power structures, some of the societal forms of oppression. Our hope too is also to think about how are these communities that we are working in collaboration with, in concert with, how are they ultimately getting emancipated and transformed? And it's not necessarily that we're emancipating them or transforming them, but that in many ways that what are they able to do to be, to find a meaningful way to speak to emancipation and what that ultimately means for them. How is emancipation even purposeful? And is that what they want too? And what does that look like in terms of what they want? The other piece here is, in terms of transformation and emancipation, it's also about transforming the system and looking at the ways, not just at individuals and communities, but also really looking at about how are we even transforming the systems, the mechanisms that are in these systems, and the forms of power, structures, and inequities that continue to show up in these systems. Because part of what we're doing, right, is we're undoing history. We're locating that this historical lineage of how so many of these power structures continue to reshape and mutate into different forms. I think of, for example, a good example here, right, just in practice, is people think, I've heard this so many times in my life, but people think we're in a post-racial society, and I'm like, I want us to take a step back and walk through that again. But and I always say, okay, well, maybe you have not seen explicit forms of racism, but what do you think about what happens when you see the effects of microaggressions and what that does psychologically to historically marginalized communities, individually and collectively? So yeah, sorry, I'm going on a train here. So thank you for following me. So and I think in many cases here, we're also looking at like what's going to be the outcome, right, of a strong critical research study. And so I like using these two pieces to really help us underscore what this ultimately means. So I think in many ways, when you think about when you start thinking about the design of a critical research method or critical research study, it's like, how can you think about ways that you're revealing ignorance and indifference? So it's like I love the way that Guba and Lincoln position this. They chart it as erosion of ignorance. And so you're revealing some pieces that sometimes are not just profound, but sometimes can also speak to ways that might be put in many ways the researcher at some risk, and ways that, because they are basically trying to say, you know what, we can't sit with this and live with this on our conscience. The other piece here is, how do you think about empowering action, right? So I think about, and I'm sure Dr. Javier Casado Perez will also speak to this, and Dr. Adrian Irby will also speak to this, but as they show different examples in their webinars, but how we're even thinking about what is going to be the outcome, right, of our particular research study. I thought about this, and part of the way that I think about some research studies, right, I even thought about the interview protocol and thought about how do we shape ways that we're asking participants so now that we're conscious of these experiences and we're conscious of the systems that we are situated in, what kinds of action and activism are going to ultimately take part? What are we going to collectively do? What can I do? What can the person next to me do? And so that's the hope and the outcome that can certainly come from a critical research study. The other piece here is, I think I'm gonna reference many of our collaborators here today, but really thinking about how our work is in partnership and conversation with participants. And I think about, so for example, Dr. Cade, I mean, thinking about what happens here is that sometimes we don't want to just exoticize our participants, right? And I'm actually going to use something from Eve Tuck later in this webinar, but really thinking about how are we even, so a good example, I'm going to think about, sorry, I'm jumping here, but a good example that I wanted to share was, I was so moved by one of a good friend and colleague, Dr. Miranda Ward, who is still at GW, teaching in, I'm pretty sure it's in public health, so medical sciences and public health. And so I can remember when she presented her dissertation to a class, she was basically talking about health equity and the way that we design a curriculum and train for health equity among youth, particularly, and so talking about that, but she was also, I think, in that study really talking about how do urban youth really understand their urban identity. And so what she had done was she infused dramaturgical coding. She also had participants also actually participate in the coding process. So they had to work with her in terms of like selecting codes and deciding, okay, what are we going to filter out here of our story? What are we going to put into the story? So sometimes there are different ways or mechanisms to really introduce that. Other pieces here. So a good example is, I was also at this point where I know this is almost like a proverbial mechanism in qualitative research, but some people who just say, okay, I'm going to send the transcript, and that is my member check for today. I'm going to send the transcript. I may not get anything back from my participant, and then I'm going to write about it, right? And to me, this is why so to sort of upend that whole dynamic and mechanism in qualitative research, what I sometimes recommend is, okay, how about you have a conversation with your participants about what you've coded and what kind of themes that you're seeing because maybe that's not what they've seen in their story. Maybe that's what you saw in their story, but maybe that's not what they saw. So thinking about that piece. The other piece here is also really thinking about, and remembering, you know, sometimes, is this a recorded member check meeting or is this an unrecorded member check meeting? Because again, sometimes that also plays into censorship of some of our participants. Okay, let's keep moving. Okay, so I know for people who are getting to know me or who have known me, intersectionality is what I live and breathe. So I know I'm gonna go through this in a way that hopefully can be connected to the way that we think about research design. But my hope is that, you know, we can certainly think through some of these pieces together. So what I want to highlight here is these 6 themes that Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge identify in their work. And so specifically what they have identified too are these 6 themes. And they wanted to make the work of intersectionality much more accessible, not just for academics and researchers, but really to help practitioners, to help individuals who are not in the academic world access this work. And so what they were doing here is really trying to pare this down into 6 different ways of thinking, thinking about how these different pieces ultimately comprise this paradigm. So I'm going to walk through these because it looks like a lot of jargon all on one slide. So I'm going to walk through some of these. So social context, so that's the background. That's the way that I would put it. That's the background. So social context can look like the community you're living in, the rural community of Idaho. It can look like the rural community of Montana. It can also look like I'm centered in the suburban or urban community in Los Angeles. So social context is almost like we're setting the parameters up for whether we are situated in privilege or oppression. So because sometimes, right, like we may experience different forms of oppression, or they might be even much more amplified in certain social contexts. Social inequality. So part of what we do with intersectionality and how we make it purposeful in research design is really understanding how we can speak to social inequality, but I also want to go a step further here, but also talking about social inequity, because it's not just about whether somebody's not getting the resources that they need, it's also the kind of power and access that they don't have, or the culture that has been built to set up barriers for them throughout time and history. And so in many ways here, we can't have an intersectional research study if we're really not talking about social inequity, and if we're not necessarily analyzing that. These 2 pieces work in tandem together, but relationality and complexity. So it essentially is acknowledging and locating that we are, that our social identities are connected, right? So I'm not just a person of color, but I'm also a queer person of color. I'm also not just a person of color who's also a queer person of color, but I'm able-bodied and I'm male, a cis male. And so in many ways, we're looking through those different pieces. And sometimes I've walked through some colleagues through this, right? When they're trying to figure out, what paradigm am I using? Should I use this? Should I use this? And I'm like, okay, hold on a minute. I don't necessarily think it's an intersectional research question if you're really not walking through some of these intersections in your interview protocol or even in your research question. So it's not just about, I'm going to investigate this phenomenon with this particular community, but sometimes it's also about how do these communities even sense or make sense of the phenomenon of having these different intersections. So that might be another way to distinguish what that relationality and complexity really look like. Or how do these participants within this group really navigate racism and heterosexism collectively? So really like understanding how they're navigating those intersections of racism and heterosexism. That's another example. I love Lisa Boleg and the work that Lisa Boleg has been doing, particularly around intersectionality and transporting it into different disciplinary spaces. So if anybody knows Lisa Boleg, full professor at George Washington University in social psychology, but also has mainstreamed a lot of intersectionality into different spaces. So certainly in sociology, social psychology, public health, but in many of these cases, I love the way that Lisa Boleg and Greta Bauer speak to this, really thinking about the fact that intersectionality cannot occur if we're not talking about power. You can't have intersectionality if you're not talking about power. And so in many of those ways, we have to really integrate that and put that into some form within our data analysis, our data collection, and even the ways that we're asking the research question. So if you remember from the last slide when I was talking about critical theory, we can't really embody critical theory if we're not talking about action, empowerment, in these different pieces, if we're not talking about activism and advocacy. So same thing with intersectionality. You can't be talking about intersectionality if there's going to be no systematic action or change that is going to be an outcome. So you can't have intersectionality if it's not a social justice agenda attached to it. Right. Oh, before we keep moving, I added this piece here. So what I want everybody to identify too, and here's the other piece that I have a concern with when I think about the ways that some of these critical paradigms have been taken up. I think what happens is that and this is even how I teach my advanced multicultural class, I think about how I teach and make sure that our students, our colleagues know that they have to not only locate what the scholarship looks like around these critical paradigms in the last 5 years, but also who are the seminal scholars, the seminal forerunners and luminaries who have given root to this work. So in many ways, I think with intersectionality, of course, like people cite Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw left and right, of course, right? But even then, in those conversations, they have been speaking to a variety of different scholars who have been tracing this history for so long. Gloria Anzaldúa, Patricia Hill Collins, the Combahee River Collective, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Shere Moraga. So, all right, so let's keep going here. Okay, now we're also jumping into critical race theory. You know, and this is one where I often see it also being implemented in some ways that have been really interesting, because I think it's become, sometimes critical race theory has become a buzzword for almost everything that we talk about in race and racism. And I think in some ways to implement it, right, there's this process to it. But we're also understanding this as a way to locate that race and racism are woven into all these structures, educational structures, policy, everyday lived experiences. And critical race theory acknowledges and essentially establishes that people in our society, not just people, but the ways how all these systems have been set up, that whiteness is considered property, and that in order to gain status, right, you have to use your whiteness. And so that's where some of this, these issues have been problematic. So when you're implementing a critical race theory study, what you're also identifying too is some of these different aspects, right? So counter narratives. And I think in some ways, really understanding that how those counter narratives show up, and how sometimes for some of our participants, they are actually speaking to ways that they've had to buck the system, ways that they've had to denounce and eliminate inequities in their lives, ways that they've even understood and consciously understood these barriers that sometimes exist. And not just to end the story there, because I think sometimes we end the story at counter narratives as almost a damage-centered, hopeless kind of romanticization, right? But part of this is, again, coming back to that action piece. How are, even when we think about people who have been racialized, who have been affected and minoritized based on race and racism, that how are they also collectively feeling empowered, and how are they even understanding their cultural capital and how that shows up in the world? and why they are valuable. And so in many ways, in many pieces, I'm really thinking about how those counter narratives are actually looking at ways that we think about students of color, people of color, racialized groups as essentially as holders of knowledge, valuable holders of knowledge. And of course, many CRT scholars will often acknowledge that race and racism are also joined with other forces of oppression. CRT and intersectionality have a very close relationship, but certainly I'm in the business of thinking that they are also distinct in their own ways. And I think as we see intersectionality, it is worthy, and the merit that it has is its own distinct paradigm, really. So I wanted to share that with everybody. All right, let's keep jumping here. So I know that we'll be sharing these materials with you, but I wanted to identify some key scholars. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I certainly want to identify this as we walk through. So, you know, if anybody's familiar with, of course, like some of the four major forerunners are like Derek Bell, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Danny Solorzano, Dolores Delgado Bernal. So again, different people here who have also been rooted in this work and rooted to expanding not just the theorization of the work, but also the implementation of the work. I really love Cheryl Matias's work. I believe Dr. Cheryl Matias is now at Denver University, formerly at University of Colorado, Denver, but at Denver University now. But talks about critical whiteness and the emotionality of whiteness. And I have her text here. So sorry, again, I have 30 books sitting on this desk with me right now. So I was gonna make regular appearances from the Library of Chan, and it's moving slower than I intended. So, but of course, sorry, before I jump into some of the critical race theory piece, Lorian Zaldúa, Borderlands, La Frontera. So this is also really helpful text. I wanted to identify, this is a newer text from Patricia Collins, but this was recently released, I believe in 2019. So, but this is one of Patricia Collins' most recent work. So this is also really helpful. This is, I think, built in as certainly intersectionality as critical social theory. So it's much more, of course, like theorizing. I'm trying to make sure I have my other text here. Here it is. So if you saw Patricia Collins and Sirma Bilge in my last text, but what I wanted to identify here was, so this is just intersectionality, but this is the one that is certainly helpful when we think about how to implement this work in ways that are that speak to practitioners and a wider audience, and not just a very like theorizing kind of audience. Okay, so the other piece here, so now that we're talking about critical race theory, right? So I like this one, particularly by Dolores Delgado Bernal and Enrique Alemán, but Transforming Educational Pathways for Chicana and Chicano Students, a Critical Race Feminista Praxis. So, okay. I think we're also, because it's getting recorded, we're gonna be listing all these resources, and also I'll send them out to everybody too. I know it's hard to catch everything. The other piece here, I also like this. This is by Taylor, Gilborn, and Ladson-Billings. It's edited, it's an edited volume, but Foundations of Critical Race Theory in Education. All right, and of course, if anybody's familiar with Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchis' work, this is also a really good introduction, but Critical Race Theory in Introduction. Okay, let's see. So, all right, let's keep moving on. Okay, so What's also important here is even identifying critical disability theory and studies. So I do really like how we have to magnify our work around people living with disabilities. Like, I think sometimes that gets lost in the scope of what we do with equity, inclusion, and diversity, and what we do with multiculturalism and social justice. And sometimes it gets partitioned out to a variety of different, like, it's almost like, oh, well, that's only what clinical rehab counseling is doing. I was like, no, 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 no. That's what we all should be doing and what we all should be focusing on in a variety of different ways in the counseling profession and in counselor education. But as you think about the purpose, right, of what you're doing with a critical disability theory study or critical disability study, you have to do, so some of this is like the exposure of ableism and saneism in our society. So ableism, of course, like showing up in visible and invisible disabilities, but also really talking about saneism and how that manifests, of course, like especially in our field, particularly with psychiatric disabilities and mental illness. So really understanding too that that saneism is a very important part of our conversation, and a very important part of what we're trying to deconstruct and dismantle in critical disability theory and in our society. The other piece here is elucidating or putting attention to the invisibility of disability. And so just as I was sharing in the beginning, sometimes we lose sight of that in the scope of multiculturalism and social justice. The other piece here, so talking about ableism and saneism and how that how we built in those roots and manifestations of structural violence. So saying that, you know, here, like we often, it's not just about exclusion and excluding resources from communities who are living with disabilities, but really understanding too that, and showcasing that here are the different ways that people living with disabilities have been harmed by society. So in that way. The other piece here is also, I want to highlight these two pieces together, that disability is not a dichotomy. And so it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, you have a disability or you don't have a disability. It's much more recognized as a continuum. And I think we need to honor that, particularly when we do a study that's grounded in critical disability theory. The other piece here is like, so just thinking about ways that you're probably working with participants, right? That part of what the hope and outcome is here is self-determination and autonomy. And really understanding and exposing ways that we, so similar to what I was talking about with critical race theory and understanding students of color, people of color as cultural holders of knowledge, valuable holders of knowledge. In the same way, it's almost like this self-determination and autonomy that we need to also to amplify, particularly among communities living with disabilities. And also to note that disability is actually a socially constructed construct or concept. And so that's what we're also exposing as a part of that when we think collectively of what goes into a critical disability study. And then, of course, commodification. So this is kind of rooted in that structural violence, the invisibility. Commodification refers to disability essentially as something that the medical field has commodified and is actually profited from. So it's become like this capitalist system, right? Profiting from individuals and people living with disabilities. All right, let's keep moving. All right, so now, here's the key takeaway that I will give from queer theory. One of the biggest issues, and this is the part where I also know that I had to learn and grow and do the work for myself, but queer theory is actually not necessarily about dismantling heteropatriarchy or cis heteropatriarchy. And it's much more about actually subverting fixed identities and binaries. So I think that's the purpose. And I think when you think about how you frame your research questions under the lens of queer theory, it probably is going to refer much more to binaries and understanding how people are, they're basically sharing their narratives to dismantle the binaries or say that, these binaries don't necessarily exist. or that these binaries are socially constructed. So in many ways, really recognizing that and showing maybe through time and history that these gender identity, sexual and affectional category, or sexual and affectional identity categories are actually socially constructed, and they have given root to these binaries. So again, the focus here is like, again, your research question, your data collection, your data analysis can really attend to the ways that you're figuring out, okay, how do I dismantle these binaries? Because queer theorists also see the hegemony and the power rooted in those binaries. So it's like a different way, right, of advocacy and activism by really attending to the binaries. Sorry, a lot of jargon. But my hope is that that's a key takeaway that everybody can take. So also queer theory with a lot of queer methods. So you might be drawing from different types of data collection, right? So it may not look like this, where you're doing semi-structured interview protocols. What it might look like is you're looking at historical documents, you're looking at websites, you're looking at social media. So you're looking through a variety of different ways to attend to data. Here are some good texts that I do really like. And sometimes you might be looking at literary text. So this is by an edited volume by Kath Brown and Catherine Nash, but Queer Methods and Methodologies. Oh my gosh, sorry, the title's not coming up. So here we go. So, but Brown and Nash, and so that's cited here. Also, this edited volume, Imagining Queer Methods by Amin Ghaziani and Matt Brim. And Ghaziani is also a sociologist. So I really love the way that they have invoked so much of the history and the understanding and the comprehension of what queer methods really looks like and how they speak to it. Okay, so the other piece here, I also like this. This is much more focused on sociology, but I think it's relevant for us too in counselor education. Other, please specify. Also, Sarah Ahmed is a race, gender, and often cited as a race, gender, and queer scholar. But a lot of times, I really do love this work around queer phenomenology. So this is also a really nice text to complement some of the different ways you're thinking about queer methods and how you're understanding queer theory implemented in these methods. All right, so. All right, let's jump to the next, please. So again, like some of the seminal luminaries here, like, so think about Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Gail Rubin, Halperin, Jack Halberstam, Sarah Ahmed. So these are, it's not an exhaustive list, but I often talk very much about Foucault, Butler, Sedgwick, and Rubin for sure. Okay. And let's keep jumping. All right. And this is a nice way to really close out our conversation today. Because in many ways, when we're thinking about decolonization, right? Decolonial methods, postcolonial methods, at first, it might be hard to wrap our minds around. But I think the important takeaway here is that when we're thinking about decolonial methods, it really is, we have to really think about how we're understanding and examining the epistemic and structural violence against Indigenous communities, how that has shown up, and ways that it's that violence has shown up, and is it basically not only removed, redefined, affected, harmed, but also harmed their land and their sovereignty, right? So like when Indigenous communities, when they're, it's not just about the individual experience or collective experience of Indigenous communities. It's also about understanding ways that in research that could be harming land and sovereignty. Because Indigenous communities, it's about the attachment to the culture of the land, right? So there's a piece of this where we have to honor what that means in terms of land and how we're land and sovereignty. and the ways that we have not necessarily honored that in history. So that might also mean involving Indigenous communities, scholars, authors, and activists in our work, and really helping to understand that they are not necessarily, that it's like, because I see this, actually I can remember like working with somebody in consultation and they were like, well, you know, if I just get this tribal community to work with me, then then I've checked out the list. And I was like, hold up a minute. We are not checking out boxes off a list here. This is not what this is about. So sorry, I'm getting really passionate about this. So, but in many ways, really thinking about that, and even thinking about the ways that we've even designed indigenous work around, not just within the United States or North America, but also really thinking about how indigeneity actually affects Australian communities, South Asian communities, particularly like thinking about in different continents like Africa, Europe. So really thinking about how, again, these communities are attached to the land and the culture that's attached to the land. So I think some key texts here, of course, like Eve Tuck and Wayne Young have been very, very, have been not only been cited in many cases, but have spoken particularly to different ways to how to dismantle some of this work around settler colonialism and the ways that shows up in research. So another piece here, I also really like Lee Patel's work. So this is decolonizing educational research, and that has also been really helpful, particularly with understanding and really implementing and critically thinking about who we are as researchers. I also really love, so like not just, of course, like Eve Tuck does a foreword in here, but not just Eve Tuck's work, but also Donaldo Macedo. Very, very strong work around this. Something that might help overall for critical methods is really looking at Frantz Fanon's work, Black Skin, White Mask. Yes, yes. And in fact, Eve Tuck and Wayne Young actually identify and cite Frantz Fanon in their work. But this is also very seminal and important. I also like, gotta make sure I don't drop things here. I also like this edited volume, Toward What Justice, also by Eve Tuck and Wayne Young. Okay. And there's one more that I will also share because I can't find in my office today, but it's by Linda Tuwai Smith. But it's talking about decolonizing methodologies. So particularly doing work with research in Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples. Okay, all right, well, I think that's about it with, just for today. And I know, again, as I share this in community with you, that this is the launching point. This is only the beginning. So I want to say thank you so much for taking this journey with me and with us together. And I hope to see you at a conference in the future or another professional development opportunity. And certainly reach out anytime. Send me an email. I'm happy to connect, talk shop about research methods, especially critical research methods and texts that might be helpful or ways that I can be helpful and supportive to any of our community members in terms of this process.